the unthinkable displacement. The plane was already humming with the soft murmurs of passengers settling into their seats, the rhythm of their lives falling into place as the aircraft started its journey through the clouds. But in the VIP section, at the front of the cabin, sat Avery Caldwell, the CEO of a thriving tech empire, a man who had spent years battling through every possible obstacle to reach the heights of success. He enjoyed today. The tailored suit he wore fit him perfectly, as if it were an extension of his personality, sharp and confident. His posture, straight and strong, exuded the kind of power and control that came from being on top of the business world. Avery was no stranger to the attention that his position demanded, but this moment was different. As he settled into the luxurious seat that had been reserved for him, he felt a sense of satisfaction. He had earned this seat. He had earned every privilege he now enjoyed in this first-class cabin, and he wasn't about to let anything take that away from him. Yet something seemed off in the air. The usual calm and professionalism that came with flying first class felt disrupted the flight. Attendants moved quickly through the aisles, attending to passengers, as if they were preparing for something, but Avery could tell there was something about the way they were glancing at each other and avoiding his gaze that felt odd, unsettling. Even then, it happened. A soft knock came at the door to his section, and as the door opened, the face of the stewardess who had entered was pale, her eyes wide with uncertainty, the kind of uncertainty one felt when facing a situation they knew would lead to confrontation. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to vacate your seat," she said, her voice trembling just a little, though she tried to keep it steady. Avery looked up from his seat, his expression still composed, but inside something shifted, like the moment before a storm made its appearance. This was not a request. This was not a simple mistake. Avery had flown all over the world. He had been in situations where last-minute changes happened, but this felt different. "What do you mean, vacate my seat?" Avery asked, the calm in his voice almost unnerving, but inside his chest his heart was already starting to beat faster. "I've paid for this seat." The words were measured and deliberate, as if he were already anticipating what might come next. The stewardess hesitated, glancing behind her as if looking for support from someone else. Avery noticed the captain standing near the cockpit door. The other flight attendants lingered just outside. It was clear that something was happening, something that had nothing to do with him or his rights as a passenger. She spoke again, her voice faltering this time. "We need this seat for a priority passenger," she said quietly, but the way she said it was enough to raise Avery's suspicions. This wasn't just about a seat being reassigned, this was about something else. He stood up slowly, still keeping his calm, but his mind raced with questions that had no answers, at least not yet. "And why exactly should I give up my seat?" Avery asked the question, but already he could feel his muscles tightening, his fists clenching under the table. The steady calm he usually carried with him now felt like a distant memory as his mind began to reel at the implications. "I'm afraid it's a requirement, sir," the stewardess said, her words barely a whisper. But Avery's eyes narrowed as she stepped aside and allowed the woman she had been preparing to escort to step into the cabin. The woman in question was older, well into her 50s at least, and as she walked toward the front of the plane, there was an undeniable sense of authority about her. The way she held herself with an almost regal air, but there was something else to a confidence that could only come from someone who had never really had to face resistance from others in their life. She was dressed in a fur coat, an expensive one at that, and her heels clicked sharply on the polished floor of the cabin as she walked down the aisle past the seats of the other passengers who watched with varying levels of interest and curiosity. Avery felt the anger building inside him, the kind of anger that came when you realized that you had been humiliated without reason. As the woman passed him, she didn't even glance in his direction, her eyes forward, her focus entirely on herself, as if she knew that she was the one who was entitled to this space, entitled to this luxury, entitled to have things simply handed to her. Avery felt his fists tighten once more, but there was no way out. Now the stewardess had already moved to the side. The decision had been made, and Avery knew that any argument here would be pointless. Any protest would be met with resistance that only further affirmed the very thing that was happening, a sense of privilege and entitlement that seemed to exist solely because of who this woman was and who he was not. The thought gnawed at him, his mind filled with questions of fairness and equality. But these questions would not be answered today, not in this moment. With this woman in this seat, Avery had always prided himself on his ability to keep his composure, no matter what the world threw at him. But this was different. This wasn't just about a seat being reassigned. It was about something far more insidious, the systems in place that granted privileges to certain people just because of their status or wealth. And here, he was about to be shoved aside, without a second thought. A man who had fought against every possible obstacle to get where he was had now been reduced to a mere inconvenience for someone with a much higher status than him. Avery took a deep breath, though his anger was far from dissipating, as he stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. The woman now sitting in his seat did not even acknowledge him. Instead, she smiled at the stewardess, as if everything had unfolded exactly as it should have, and Avery could feel the weight of that smile settle into his chest like a stone. Her presence in his seat was a symbol of something far more troubling than just a change in seating arrangements, and he knew this was not something he could easily let go of. Avery didn't speak another word as he slowly walked down the aisle toward the coach section of the plane, his steps measured, but every muscle in his body was on edge, his thoughts spiraling faster than he could control. He didn't need to be told that this moment was more than just about being displaced. It was a signal that no matter how much he had achieved, no matter how many companies he had built from the ground up, no matter how many times he had fought for his seat at the table, the world would always find ways to remind him that there were still those who thought they could take it away from him at a whim. The realization settled heavily in his stomach as he took his new seat in the back of the plane, one that felt far too cramped for someone like him to be sitting in. But as he settled into it, he looked around the cabin and noticed that the whispers had started. It was subtle at first, the occasional glance from passengers who had witnessed the exchange, but it was there, a quiet but unmistakable murmur of judgment and curiosity. Avery could feel the eyes on him as he settled into the cramped seat, the weight of their gaze pressing down on him, but he refused to let it show on his face. The anger, the humiliation, the frustration, all of it was simmering just beneath the surface. But no one would see it. No one would get the satisfaction of knowing how deeply this moment had affected him. Avery had never been the kind of man to let things like this shake him, not publicly, but as he sat there he realized something important. This wasn't just about being moved. This wasn't just about a seat at all. This was about making sure he never forgot his place. He took another deep breath, steadying himself as the plane began to lift into the sky, and he knew this moment would haunt him, but he was not going to let it break him. Not now, not ever. The tipping point. As the plane climbed higher and higher into the sky, Avery Caldwell remained seated in the cramped coach section, his eyes locked on the seat in first class, the one that had once been his, the seat that had been taken from him with no explanation beyond the cold efficiency of a system that valued one person's status over another's dignity. There was a sting in his chest, a heaviness in the pit of his stomach, but he didn't allow it to show. His expression remained calm, his hands resting on his lap, but inside his mind the storm was brewing. Thoughts racing with questions that had no answers, questions about fairness and power, about the unspoken rules that governed society, about how one's position in life could so easily be appended with a few cold words from someone who believed their place in the world was above all others. Avery clenched his fists just a little tighter under the table. But he didn't make a scene. The last thing he wanted was to give them the satisfaction of seeing his anger, but the anger was there, simmering below the surface, threatening to boil over, and for the first time in a long time, Avery wondered how much longer he could keep it contained. The cabin of the plane was quiet, save for the low hum of the engine, the gentle clinking of the cart being pushed down the aisle, and the occasional murmur of conversation from the other passengers. But Avery's mind was elsewhere, his eyes flickering between the flight attendants, who moved swiftly through the cabin as though they were walking on eggshells, and the passengers, who watched the scene unfold with quiet curiosity. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sense that something had shifted, but no one was willing to speak it aloud. The stewardess who had first asked him to leave his seat passed by once again, her movements quick and purposeful as she avoided making eye contact. With him she was doing her job, he knew that, but there was something about her attitude that stung. She had been so quick to dismiss him, so ready to follow orders without a second thought, without even questioning whether what she was doing was right or wrong. Avery couldn't let that go. It was like a splinter lodged deep in his mind, irritating him more and more with each passing second. He watched her move with the same practiced efficiency that had caused him to be displaced, but there was something about her now, something he couldn't quite place, something that made him feel as if she wasn't just a pawn in this situation, but an active participant in the system that had led to his humiliation. Avery's eyes narrowed, and For a moment he considered speaking to her directly, to ask her why she had done it, why she had taken part in this, but he held his tongue. What would it matter now? What could she possibly say to make him feel better, to make this moment right again? There was nothing she could say, nothing anyone could say to fix what had happened. It was a wrong that could not be undone, and Avery knew it. But as the minutes passed and the flight continued on its course, Avery's mind remained focused on one thing: revenge, not in the way most people might think, not a public outburst or some dramatic confrontation in the middle of the cabin, but a quiet determination that burned within him, a desire to make sure that what had happened to him would not go unanswered. He had the power to do something about this. He had the connections, he had the resources, he had the voice that could be heard above the noise, and he was going to make sure it was heard. He had spent too long fighting for his place in the world to let something like this pass without consequence. This was not just about a seat on a plane. It was about a system that allowed people like him to be treated as if they were disposable. It was about the constant reminder that no matter how far he had come, no matter how much he had achieved, there would always be someone who thought they were better than him simply because of the color of his skin or the size of his bank account. Avery took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of the plane as he watched the stewardess disappear into the galley, his thoughts swirling like a whirlpool. He knew what he had to do. He had to act, and he had to act quickly, because if he didn't, if he allowed this moment to pass without making a stand, then he would be no better than the people who thought they could treat him this way, no better than the people who used their status and wealth to trample on others. Avery stood up suddenly, causing a few heads to turn in his direction. The movement was deliberate, the action clear. He wasn't going to sit back and let this moment define him. He wasn't going to be the man who sat in silence while the world treated him as if he were invisible. The stewardess, who had been avoiding his gaze earlier, looked up in surprise when she saw him standing in the aisle. She took a step toward him, but hesitated, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to handle a passenger who was no longer willing to sit quietly and accept what was happening. Avery's voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it that could not be ignored. "I need to speak to the captain," he said, his tone firm with an air of finality that made it clear he wasn't going to back down. The stewardess looked as if she were about to protest, but then stopped herself. She had likely seen men like Avery before, the kind who demanded answers, the kind who expected the world to treat them with respect, the kind who refused to be silenced. She turned away without a word and headed toward the cockpit. Moments later, she returned with the captain behind her. The captain looked at Avery with a mix of confusion and curiosity. As he approached, Avery could see the uncertainty in his eyes, but there was no turning back now. Avery wasn't going to let this pass. "I want an explanation," Avery said, his voice low but unmistakably demanding. "Why was I moved from my seat for that woman, and why is it that she gets to stay in the seat I paid for?" The captain hesitated, his eyes darting between Avery and the stewardess, as if searching for the right words to say, but Avery wasn't going to let him off that easy. "This is not about a seat, it's about a system that has allowed people to believe they are entitled to more, simply because of who they are," Avery continued, his voice rising slightly now as he allowed the anger to flow just beneath the surface. "I have earned my seat, I've earned everything. I have worked my entire life to get to this point, and yet here I am being treated as if I don't matter, as if my place in this world is somehow less than hers." The captain opened his mouth to speak, but Avery cut him off. "You will move her out of that seat now, and if you don't, I will make sure the entire world knows what's happened here." The captain stiffened at Avery's words, the weight of his threat hanging in the air, but Avery wasn't finished yet. "I want the truth to be heard. I want people to know that this is not just about a seat on a plane. This is about a system that needs to change." The captain looked at the stewardess, his eyes filled with doubt and hesitation, and Avery could see the struggle in his face, but there was no turning back now. Avery had made his decision. He would not be silenced. He would not allow this injustice to go unnoticed. He would make sure that what had happened to him would never happen again. The captain finally nodded, though he still looked uncertain. "I'll take care of it," he said, his voice strained, and he turned away. Avery sat back down in his seat, his eyes still burning with the fury of the moment. He knew that the battle was far from over, but for the first time since this had all started, Avery felt a sense of victory brewing inside him. It wasn't about the seat, it wasn't about the woman in first class. It was about something much larger, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. The time for silence was over. It was time to make a stand. The firestorm. Avery Caldwell heart raced with a strange sense of satisfaction as the flight continued its path through the clouds. The captain had agreed to move the woman from her seat, but Avery knew this was only the beginning. The moment had been a turning point, a clear indication that something bigger was at play. It wasn't just about a seat on a plane, or the privileges of a few over the many. It was about a system that perpetuated inequality and forced those who fought the hardest to the margins and left them to face indignities without recourse. Avery sat back in his seat, the anger still simmering beneath the surface, but something else was growing. Within him a sense of resolve that he had never felt before. It was as if the humiliation he had endured had ignited something deeper within him, something that demanded change, something that refused to be ignored. The minutes stretched on as the plane sailed through the sky, and Avery's thoughts swirled like a storm. He knew that his actions couldn't stop with the simple removal of a passenger from a seat that wasn't even his. To begin with, it couldn't just end here. There was a larger battle to be fought, a battle against a system that allowed the powerful to trample over the rights of the powerless, a system that didn't think twice about humiliating someone like him because of the color of his skin or the amount of money in his bank account. He clenched his fists beneath the table, but this time it wasn't with anger, it was with purpose. He was no longer just a man on a plane heading to his next meeting or his next success story. No, he was a man who had seen firsthand how deep the wounds of inequality ran, and he was going to make sure that the world knew about it. Avery didn't know how long he sat there, his mind buzzing with ideas and strategies for what was to come, but the idea was clear. His next move had to be swift and decisive. The world needed to know what had happened, and he would make sure that it did. His reputation, his career, his influence, all of that was now secondary to something far more important. He would be the one to speak out. He would be the one to expose the ugly truth that lay beneath the surface of what had happened here. He wasn't about to let the system off the hook, not when he had the power to make it right, or at least to fight for the chance to make it right. And so it began. The firestorm that would follow his decision spread faster than he could have anticipated. The moment he had stepped off that plane and into the airport terminal, he felt the weight of the world's gaze upon him. The story had already broken. The news outlets were abuzz with reports about the incident, and soon social media was flooded with posts from people who had seen the video and heard the story. The headlines were unforgiving. CEO kicked out of VIP seat for white passenger, humiliation at 30 feet, power struggle between a CEO and an airline, the seat that was stolen. The reactions were mixed, but one thing was certain. People were talking. The airline was under fire from every direction. Passengers who had witnessed the scene were posting their accounts on social media, and others were flooding the company's customer service lines with complaints, demanding answers within hours. Avery was receiving messages from all over the world, from people applauding him for standing up for his rights, from people offering their support from those who had faced similar indignities in their own lives. The support was overwhelming, but Avery knew that this was only the beginning. There was still so much work to be done, and the battle was far from over. The airline was scrambling to respond. They issued a public statement apologizing to Avery and promising to investigate the incident. But Avery could see through the carefully crafted words. They were doing nothing more than trying to save face. Their apology wasn't genuine. It wasn't an acknowledgement of the deep-seated issues that had allowed this to happen in the first place. It was a way to quiet the masses and move on, but Avery wasn't about to let that happen. He wasn't going to let the moment slip by without demanding real change. He knew that the airline's apology was nothing but a hollow gesture. They were trying to appease the public. But the reality was that nothing would change unless the system itself was challenged, and that's exactly what Avery intended to do. He sat at his desk in his office in the days that followed the storm, only growing in intensity. His inbox was flooded with messages from reporters asking for his side of the story, from activists offering their support, from politicians wondering what steps they could take to address the larger issues of inequality and privilege that had been exposed by his experience. Avery took it all in and processed each message carefully. He knew that this wasn't just a personal battle anymore. It was a battle for something much larger than himself. It was a battle for the people who had been silenced for far too long, for the people who had suffered in the shadows of the powerful. Avery knew that he could make a difference. He had the platform, he had the voice, and he had the resources to bring the fight to the forefront of public attention. But he also knew that it wasn't going to be easy. There would be resistance. There would be people who tried to discredit him, people who would say that he was simply a man trying to get attention or trying to make an issue out of nothing. But Avery was undeterred. His conviction had only grown stronger. In the days since the incident, he was going to use this moment as a catalyst for change, and nothing was going to stand in his way. The public pressure on the airline continued to mount as more and more people joined the conversation. It wasn't just about Avery's experience anymore. It was about the larger issues that had been exposed. By that moment, the world was waking up to the fact that systems of inequality and privilege were alive and well, and Avery was at the center of the conversation. He knew that this was a pivotal moment in history, and he was determined to make sure that it wasn't wasted soon. The stories of discrimination that had been silenced for so long began to surface. People who had been treated unfairly because of their race or gender or social status began to speak out and share their experiences, and Avery's decision to stand up to the airline had given them the courage to do so. Avery saw the momentum building, and he knew that it was time to strike. While the iron was hot, he began reaching out to lawmakers and influencers in the world of social justice to align himself with people who were dedicated to making a difference. Together they would force the issue into the spotlight and demand real reform. Avery started to hold meetings with his team and strategize how best to move forward. His focus was clear. He wasn't just fighting for justice for himself. He was fighting for the countless others who had been pushed to the margins, who had been made to feel like their worth was determined by the color of their skin or the wealth in their bank account. Avery knew that his influence in the corporate world would be a tool for change, but he also knew that the fight wouldn't be easy. The road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but Avery wasn't afraid of the challenge. This was his time to take action and make sure that what had happened to him never happened to anyone else again. He would use his voice, his platform and his resources to take on the powerful and make the world a better place for those who had been denied a seat at the table. The aftermath, the days that followed, were unlike anything Avery Caldwell had ever experienced. His name was everywhere. His image was on television screens and news websites across the globe. The story had taken on a life of its own, becoming more than just a personal account of humiliation. It had become a symbol, a rallying cry for those who had faced injustice in their own lives and had been silenced or ignored for far too long. Avery had always been used to attention. The life of a high-profile CEO naturally came with media coverage and interviews, but this was different. This was raw and charged with emotion. Every news anchor, every talk show, every social media thread seemed to be discussing the same thing: the injustice that had occurred on that plane, the arrogance of the airline staff, and the deep cracks in a system that still judged people based on skin color and assumed privilege instead of merit. Avery had gone back to his office the morning after the story broke, determined not to hide from the spotlight. He walked into the building with the same calm, confident stride he had always had, but this time the employees stood a little straighter when they saw him, their eyes filled with respect and admiration. Some stopped him in the hallway to shake his hand or quietly say thank you. Others simply nodded in silent acknowledgement. They knew what he had done. They understood the weight of it. Avery was no longer just their leader. He had become a symbol of courage in the boardroom. Avery sat down with his executive team and laid out his intentions. This was not going to be a fleeting headline. He would not allow the outrage to fade, and for everything to return to normal. He spoke with conviction, his voice steady and powerful as he explained that they would use every resource at their disposal to push for real change. Not just at the airline, but across industries. Policies needed to be examined, discrimination needed to be exposed, accountability needed to be enforced. His team listened intently, some taking notes, others simply absorbing the gravity of what he was saying. There was no hesitation from any of them. They knew Avery meant every word, and they were ready to follow his lead. Within 48 hours, Avery had met with civil rights leaders, activists, and legal experts. Together they began drafting a formal case against the airline, not just for the public humiliation he had suffered, but for the broader pattern of discrimination that had surfaced in the wake of the story. They had uncovered testimonies from dozens of other passengers, each one revealing a disturbing pattern of preferential treatment that mirrored Avery's own experience. These were not isolated incidents. They were the result of a deeply flawed system that had gone unchallenged for far too long. The legal team worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, compiling witness statements, and documenting every detail of the incident. Avery gave interviews every day, sometimes more than one. He sat across from journalists and anchors who asked the same question in different ways. Why did you decide to stand up? Why not just let it go? And every time, Avery's answer was the same, because letting it go would mean accepting that it was okay to treat people this way, and it is not. Okay, the airline tried to control the damage, issuing carefully worded statements and announcing an internal investigation, but Avery saw through it all. He knew they were hoping to wait out the storm to let public attention shift to the next scandal, but Avery was not going to let that happen. He made sure the conversation stayed alive, using his influence to keep the pressure on them. Every speech he gave, every post he made, every appearance he did, carried the same message. This was not over until real changes were made. Meanwhile, the public response continued to grow. Protests began to form outside the airline's corporate offices. People held signs demanding justice and calling for resignations. Hashtags trended for days. Videos of the incident were replayed endlessly online, sparking outrage and debates across social platforms. Avery found himself at the center of a movement that was far bigger than him, but he embraced the responsibility. He understood that he had the privilege of a platform, and it was his duty to use it, not for his own gain, but for the countless people who didn't have the same voice. The pressure worked. Within a week, the airline announced that several staff members involved in the incident had been terminated. They also promised to implement new training programs to address bias and discrimination, but Avery knew that training sessions alone would not fix a broken system. He publicly acknowledged their actions, but stated clearly that this was only the first step. The true measure of change would be in whether these policies were enforced, and whether passengers in the future would be treated with the dignity and respect they deserved, regardless of who they were or where they came from. Privately, Avery was exhausted. The endless interviews, the meetings with lawyers and activists, the constant media attention, it was draining. But every time he thought about slowing down, he remembered the humiliation of being walked out of that first-class seat without a word of defense from anyone. He remembered the look of entitlement on the face of the woman who replaced him, the silence of the crew who carried out the order without question, and he knew he had to keep going. One evening, Avery sat alone in his office, long after everyone else had gone home. The city lights stretched out before him through the glass wall, the hum of traffic in the distance. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the battles he had fought to build his company, the sacrifices he had made, and now, this new fight that had found him rather than the other way around. It wasn't a fight he had chosen, but it was one he was determined to. When the phone on his desk buzzed, breaking his thoughts, it was a message from a young man he had never met, a man who said that seeing Avery stand up had given him the courage to file his own discrimination complaint at his workplace. The message ended with a simple thank you. Avery stared at the words for a long moment, feeling the weight of what they meant. This was why he was doing it. This was why he could not stop. Avery leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. The battle was far from over, but he could feel the tide beginning to turn. The world was paying attention now, and he intended to make sure it kept paying attention until the change was real, until the systems that allowed this kind of injustice to happen were dismantled piece by piece. He knew there would be setbacks. He knew there would be people who fought to preserve the status quo, but he was ready for them. He had faced bigger challenges, and he had never been the type to back down. Now was not the time to stop. The incident on that plane had been meant to diminish him, to strip him of his dignity in front of strangers. Instead, it had lit a fire that was now spreading far beyond what anyone could have predicted. Avery Caldwell was no longer just a CEO. He had become a force, and the world was beginning to realize that a storm had been unleashed, one that would not settle until justice was not just promised but delivered. The reckoning days turned into weeks, and the momentum only grew stronger. The fire that had started in that cramped cabin on a flight meant to carry him quietly to his destination had spread far beyond the airline, far beyond the city, and far beyond the borders of his own life. It had become something global, a conversation, a movement, a reckoning that refused to fade into the background. Avery Caldwell stood in the center of it, not as a man seeking attention, but as someone who had been thrust into a role that demanded his full attention. His every move now mattered, his words carried weight, and his actions had the potential to inspire or to disappoint millions of people watching from all corners of the world. The airline had already suffered the first blows. Staff members were gone, the company's reputation was stained, and the stock price had dipped noticeably. But Avery knew this was not enough. Losing a few employees was not justice. It was a convenient sacrifice to appease the public, and it was nowhere near addressing the root of the problem. He had learned long ago that real change did not come from gestures. It came from structural transformation, and those in power rarely offered that willingly. Avery spent his days in constant motion, from meetings with lawmakers, to private discussions with advocacy groups, to media appearances, where he outlined exactly what needed to be done. He had a list of demands that went beyond the airline. He wanted industry-wide reforms. He wanted legislation that would hold companies accountable for discriminatory practices, and he wanted enforcement, not in the form of occasional audits or meaningless diversity statements, but through real measurable consequences. His tone in interviews was steady but unyielding. There would be no compromise on the fundamentals of equality. The corporate world had started to take notice. Other CEOs, some friends, some rivals, began to reach out privately, many to offer support, a few to warn him that pushing too hard could lead to backlash. But Avery had made peace with that possibility. He knew that those warnings were more about protecting comfortable relationships than protecting justice, and he had no interest in preserving the comfort of those who looked the other way. One of the most pivotal moments came when Avery was invited to speak before a congressional committee. The room was packed with reporters, cameras, and spectators, and Avery walked in wearing the same calm expression that had become his signature. But beneath it was a fire sharpened by weeks of preparation. He spoke for nearly an hour, recounting the events of that day, not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a witness exposing a system that allowed such things to happen over and over again. His words were measured but powerful. He connected his personal experience to the countless stories of others who had been silenced, who had been humiliated without anyone to fight for them. He spoke about the cost of silence, about the danger of allowing discrimination to be normalized, and about the responsibility of those with power to dismantle the systems that upheld it. By the time he finished, the room was silent for a moment before the applause began. It was not the polite applause of routine hearings. It was something deeper, something that carried the acknowledgement of truth. Avery left that room knowing he had shifted the conversation in a way that could not be undone. Outside of politics, the fight continued in the streets. Protests had spread to major cities. Thousands of people marched, holding signs and chanting slogans inspired by Avery's own words. Social media was flooded with images and videos from these demonstrations, and every time a new one appeared, Avery felt the responsibility grow heavier on his shoulders. This was no longer just his story. It belonged to all of them, to everyone who had been told they did not belong in a space they had earned, to everyone who had been stripped of their dignity by a system that valued appearances over fairness. The airline tried again to regain control. They offered Avery a private settlement, a large sum of money, in exchange for his silence and the closure of his legal actions. Avery refused, without hesitation. He did not need their money, and even if he had needed it, he would not have traded justice for a payout. The refusal became another headline, another moment that fueled the fire, and sent a clear message that this was not a negotiation. This was a demand for change behind closed doors. Avery's own company had transformed into a hub for activism and advocacy. The board of directors had fully backed his efforts, and his employees had thrown themselves into volunteer work, community outreach, and policy research. Avery had created a dedicated department within the company tasked with monitoring corporate discrimination and providing support to individuals fighting their own battles. His business was no longer just about technology and innovation. It had become a vehicle for justice. A turning point came when several major airlines announced a joint initiative to adopt anti-discrimination reforms, not just in policy but in practice. These changes included transparent reporting systems, mandatory diversity in leadership roles, and a zero-tolerance enforcement policy with real penalties for violations. Avery attended the press conference where these commitments were announced. Standing among executives who had once dismissed such changes as unnecessary, his presence there was both a victory and a warning, a reminder that he was watching, and that promises without action would not go unnoticed. But Avery knew the reckoning was not just about corporations. It was about people. It was about the individuals who worked in these systems, the ones who had the power to make decisions. In moments like the one he had experienced, he began traveling across the country, speaking at universities, corporations, and public forums. Not as a man telling his story, but as someone urging others to see themselves in it. He spoke about courage, about the necessity of speaking up, even when the cost was high. He told them that the moment you accept an injustice, you are helping to keep it alive. Everywhere he went, he met people who told him their stories. A woman who had been demoted because she refused to serve a customer who harassed her, a man who had been thrown out of a business meeting because someone assumed he was there, By mistake, a young girl who had been told her hair was unprofessional for a school presentation. Each story added to his resolve, each one a reminder of why he could not slow down. Their reckoning was not without its enemies. There were those who accused Avery of overreacting, of using his status to force his way into headlines, but their voices were small compared to the movement that had grown around him, and Avery did not waste his energy on them. He had learned long ago that every fight for justice attracted detractors, and he had no intention of letting them distract him from the goal. At one night, Avery sat in his home office, the only light coming from the screen of his laptop, where he read through the latest drafts of proposed legislation aimed at strengthening protections against discrimination in public accommodations. His legal team believed it had a real chance of passing, and Avery knew that if it did, it would be one of the most significant victories of his life. He leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, thinking about the chain of events that had brought him here. A single humiliating moment on a plane had turned into a nationwide conversation, into policy reform, into a movement that could change the lives of people he would never meet. He closed the laptop and looked out the window at the quiet city below, feeling the weight of both exhaustion and accomplishment. The reckoning was still unfolding. There was still more to be done, but for the first time since that day, Avery allowed himself to believe that victory was not just possible, it was inevitable. The new dawn, the morning sun poured through the tall windows of Avery Caldwell's office, casting golden light across the polished wooden floor and the shelves lined with awards, photos, and mementos from a life built through relentless effort and determination. The world outside was waking up, but inside, Avery felt as if he had been awake for months, maybe even years in truth. He had not stopped moving since that day on the plane, the day that had been just another routine flight, but instead became the spark for something far larger than he could have imagined. Now, months later, he stood at the edge of a transformation, not just for himself, but for an entire system that had once thrived on silence and complacency. The legislation he had fought for with every ounce of his resolve had passed into law. The vote had been closer than expected, but the moment the final count was announced, the chamber erupted in applause, and Avery had felt a weight lift from his shoulders, knowing that for the first time there were now concrete protections that companies could not bypass without facing serious consequences. He had stood on the steps of the Capitol building that day, flanked by lawmakers, activists, and ordinary citizens, whose voices had carried the fight to its conclusion. His speech was not one of victory alone, but of continued vigilance, because change was never permanent without constant defense. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects began to show. Airlines, hotels, and corporations across industries rushed to review their policies, fearful of the penalties they could now face, and more importantly, aware that the public was watching with sharper eyes than ever before. Avery knew that this vigilance was part of the true victory, because it was not just about passing a law, it was about changing a culture. The shift could be felt in the smallest moments: a flight attendant offering an apology without being prompted, a manager pausing to question whether a decision was fair before enforcing it, a young employee standing up for a colleague without fear of retaliation. These were the quiet signs that the tide had turned. Avery's company had evolved into a powerful advocate for fairness, launching initiatives that provided legal aid to victims of discrimination and funding educational programs aimed at dismantling bias before it could take root. He had taken his personal fight and woven it into the fabric of his business, ensuring that its legacy would extend far beyond profit margins. His employees no longer just worked for a tech firm, they were part of a mission, and they carried that pride with them into every meeting, every project, every interaction. But for Avery, the transformation was deeply personal. He had always measured success in terms of deals closed and targets met. Now his measure was the number of lives impacted, the letters he received from strangers telling him that his stand had given them courage, the moments when someone approached him in public to say they no longer felt alone in their own battles. One evening, as he walked through a crowded airport on his way to another speaking engagement, a man in his early 20s stopped him, his voice shaking as he explained that he too had been removed from a seat once for no reason other than the assumptions of others. But after hearing the story, he had challenged it, and Avery listened with a hand on the young man's shoulder, feeling the truth of why he had fought so hard. The media eventually shifted its attention, as it always did, chasing the next headline, but Avery had built something that did not depend on the fleeting attention of the news cycle. The networks and alliances formed during the fight remained strong, the advocacy groups, The legal teams, the grassroots movements, they were all still connected, still working, still holding those in power accountable, and Avery continued to lend his voice wherever it was needed, in quieter moments. Avery would think back to that exact moment on the plane, when the stewardess first asked him to leave his seat. He remembered the coldness of the words, the way the woman in the fur coat had walked past without a glance, and the weight of eyes on him as he made that long walk to the back of the cabin. It had been a humiliation, but it had also been the breaking point, the moment where he decided that enough was enough. He knew now that he had carried far more than his own pride. That day he had carried the burden of every person who had been told to move, to step aside, to know their place without question, and he had carried it into battle until the weight was shared by millions standing in his office now. Avery gazed at the framed copy of the new law on the wall, the ink still fresh in his mind. Even if the paper had been signed weeks ago, it was a reminder. That one voice could become many. That one moment could reshape an entire conversation. It was a reminder that the fight for dignity was never wasted, no matter how small it began. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from his assistant confirming his next flight. He smiled slightly at the irony, because flying had once been a simple necessity of his business, and now it carried a meaning he had never expected. He thought about how different that experience would be now, not just for him but for anyone who walked into a cabin and took their seat, knowing that the law was on their side, and that somewhere in the world a man named Avery Caldwell had refused to let a single injustice be brushed aside. He picked up his jacket, stepped out into the hallway, and made his way toward the elevator, ready for whatever came next, because the work was never truly finished. There would always be new battles, new injustices to confront, but he was no longer the man who once sat quietly in a seat as the world tried to move him aside. He was the man who had turned a moment of humiliation into a movement, and who had proven that change was possible when you refused to give up. The doors of the elevator closed around him, and for the first time in many months, Avery felt a calm settle over him, not because the fight was over, but because he knew, without a doubt, that he would be ready for the next one. And as the elevator descended and the sunlight streamed across his face, he allowed himself a small but genuine smile, knowing that somewhere out there someone was boarding a flight today, sitting in their seat with their head held high and feeling safe in the knowledge that they belonged right where they were. The end.